Welcome to the Global Sanctions Program. In this first session, we look at the sanctions framework. Sanctions are extremely important because the failure to comply with sanctions comes at significant cost. And we're going to look at the cases and anecdotes will show clearly that we cannot afford sanctions failures. So, how do we get it right in a field like sanctions, where the significant problem is the ever changing rule set? The answer is to understand the framework on which sanctions are built. We have two important frameworks to examine. The first is the generic one, which is the current session, and the second is the US sanctions framework, which is one of the largest, longest standing, and therefore more evolved sanctions framework worth learning from. So let's go ahead and look at the global sanctions framework. The global sanctions framework is largely driven by United Nations sanctions. These sanctions are passed at the UN after deliberation. The next, which one might argue is not strictly sanctions, but important to take note of because a large number of banned entities and individuals arise from the Financial Action Task Force's sanctions. They are principally aimed at anti-money laundering, countering the financing of terrorism, and associated social ills. These are globally established standards. The important difference between the UN sanction and the FATF sanction is that in the UN sanctions, there can be countries that disagree and they have the political right to disagree. But the FATF sanctions are mostly by global consensus, so that the countries which do not fully comply then get blacklisted or grey listed or watch listed. And finally, there's national sanctions. In the first instance, the national sanction of a complying country will always want to fully implement what the UN has proposed. So if the UN has passed something, as a nation that wants to belong to the community of international countries, everything that the UN said is implemented. And then every nation might have its own foreign policy, international policy, human rights policy, and so on and so forth, which create national agendas, notably the US, but not exclusively the US. So, when the United Nations passes sanctions, the concerned country needs to pass a law which implements the UN sanctions within the country. Other countries might or might not follow a particular country's national sanctions. So the UN sanctions is followed by most of the international community, but a particular country's sanctioning. For instance, even in the Russia-Ukraine crisis, where largely the world condemns the events that are happening in Ukraine, not every country has outright sanctioned Russia. In fact, if you count the European Union as 26 countries, the US as one country, 27, and then a smattering of other countries, the total number of global countries that have effectively followed US sanctions on Russia for Ukraine might be less than 50. And notably, the other economic superpower, China, is against US sanctions on Russia. That differs significantly from how a UN sanctions might operate. As we already said, for FATF sanctions, global adoption has been ensured and countries that don't implement are treated as blacklisted. Generally speaking, we could consider country and jurisdiction as synonymous. When it comes to law and enforcement, it becomes necessary to consider which parts of the country do a law apply to. Now, That might sound like an overstatement, but there are instances like Gibraltar. It's a British overseas territory. It has its own legal system, which is largely modeled on UK law, but is not implemented or limited to UK law. So Gibraltar automatically adopts UK, EU, and US sanctions as applicable in its territory, needing no specific adoption. And post Brexit, the Sanctions Act 2019 enshrines that, which means Gibraltar sanctions are additive in nature, a combination of these three, whereas the United Kingdom follows only UK law.